The manila folder sits open on a folding table under a pop-up tent, and 40 people go quiet at the same time. Command Sergeant Major Rourke, the instructor running today's course, a barrel-chested man with a voice built for cutting through gunfire, is holding a single sheet of paper like it might bite him. My brother, Marcus, Reyes by blood and by ego, the family's self-appointed tough guy, is standing at the start line in a shirt that says coach across the back, and he has gone the color of old drywall. Behind him, 40 spectators, sponsors, cousins, my mother, are waiting for someone to explain why a grown man in combat boots just told an entire obstacle course to stand down. I'm still catching my breath from the low crawl, mud in my hair, heart doing something calm and old and familiar, the thing it used to do right before a jump. Rourke looks up from the paper, finds my eyes, and says my name like it's a rank. To understand how a folding table under a tent turned into the loudest silence I've ever heard, you have to go back 3 weeks, to a backyard cookout, and a brother who has spent 30 years mistaking my quiet for weakness. My name is Elena Reyes, and I am, by the account my family has always told itself, the boring one. Marcus Reyes is my younger brother by 2 years, the one who filled every room he walked into, the one my mother introduced at parties before she introduced me. 3 weeks ago we were at my parents' house for Marcus's birthday, and he'd had 2 beers and an audience, which is the only fuel he's ever really needed. He was telling the table, my mother, my aunt, my cousin Danny, about the elite fitness boot camp he runs out of a strip mall gym, about how he'd trained actual operators, about how most people, and here he looked at me, most people wouldn't survive 5 minutes of what real toughness looks like. I said something mild. I always say something mild. He laughed, the particular laugh he's used on me since we were kids, half delight, half dismissal, and said, "Let's see how tough you really are, Elena. Come do the obstacle course at my charity thing. Unless you're scared." Everyone at the table smiled the way people smile when they think they already know how something ends. What Marcus doesn't know, what nobody at that table has ever known, because I never told them, is that I spent 6 years in the Army before law school, 4 of them as an officer, 2 of those as a Ranger-qualified company commander who ran obstacle courses for a living, not against them. I left the service quietly, went to law school on the GI Bill, and built a career in litigation without ever mentioning the deployments, the Purple Heart folded in a drawer, or the fact that I once held the fastest female time on a course that still exists, at a base 3 hours from where we were sitting. I didn't hide it out of shame. I hid it because my family had already decided who I was before I ever opened my mouth, and correcting them felt, for a long time, like more effort than it was worth. So when Marcus laughed and called me scared, I just smiled and said, "Sure. Send me the details." To understand why that answer cost me nothing, you have to understand the 2 versions of the Reyes family that existed at the same time, in the same house, without ever quite touching. There was the version where Marcus got the trophies on the mantle, the Little League ones, then the personal training certification framed in the hallway like a law degree, and where my mother's whole face lit up differently for him than it did for me. And there was the other version, the one that existed at the firm where I work, Bramwell Cho, where partners stopped talking when I walked into a deposition because they'd learned, the hard way, that I don't ask a question I don't already know the answer to. My managing partner, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Patricia Osei, once told me I had the calmest kill instinct in the building, which I've always taken as the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. At home, I was the quiet one who didn't come to enough family dinners. At work, opposing counsel requested settlement conferences specifically to avoid putting me in front of a jury. Both things were true at once, and only one of them made it back to my parents' kitchen table. My cousin Danny, my mother's sister's daughter, 2 years older than me, the only person in that family who ever treated me like a whole person instead of a placeholder, was the one who noticed the gap. Danny used to call me after big trial wins just to ask how it felt, because nobody else thought to ask. "They don't see you," she told me once, over wine, not unkindly, just true. "They see the story they decided on in 1998 and they never updated it." I told her I didn't need them to see me. That was, I'll admit now, only about 70% true. The morning after Marcus's birthday, I called Danny first. Not because I needed permission, but because she's the only person who would understand what I was about to do without needing an explanation. I told her about the challenge, about the charity obstacle course event Marcus was hosting to drum up sponsors for his gym, some kind of Veterans Grit Day, ironic given that as far as I knew, Marcus had never worn a uniform in his life, just talked like a man who had. Danny went quiet on the phone for a second, and then she said the thing that mattered most: "You're not doing this to beat him. You're doing this because you're tired of shrinking." She wasn't wrong. Somewhere between the cookout and that phone call, something in me had shifted from mild to deliberate. I decided, sitting at my kitchen counter with cold coffee, that I would build this the way I build a case, quietly, with documentation, letting the facts do the talking instead of me. The first thing I did was find out who was actually running the obstacle course. Marcus's event was being held at a National Guard training facility that occasionally rented its grounds for civilian charity events, and the course itself, I recognized it the second I saw the flyer Danny forwarded me, was the same low-crawl and cargo net layout I'd run 100 times a decade earlier, under a different name, in a different life. I didn't call ahead and announce myself. I didn't need to. Charity events like this required participant waivers and liability paperwork, standard stuff, full legal name and any relevant service history for insurance purposes. I filled mine out completely and honestly, the way I fill out every document that has my name on it, because unlike my brother, I've never needed to embellish anything to make it sound impressive. For 3 weeks, I trained the way I used to train before deployments, early mornings, unglamorous, nobody watching. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Marcus. I told Danny, and only Danny, because she was the only one who'd earned the truth. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes before you let something surface that's been buried a long time, and it isn't nervousness, it's more like checking a parachute rig you already know is packed correctly. I wasn't building a case to win an argument with my brother. I was letting a fact that had always been true finally exist somewhere other than inside my own chest. 2 nights before the event, Danny texted me one line: "He has no idea what he invited to his own party." I didn't answer. I just packed my boots. The morning of Veterans Grit Day, the training facility smelled like cut grass and diesel, and Marcus was working the small crowd like a man who'd already decided he'd won. My mother was there in a folding chair with a paper cup of coffee, my aunt beside her, and a handful of Marcus's gym clients wearing shirts with his logo. Off to the side stood a cluster of actual sponsors, a regional bank, a sporting goods chain, and a veterans outreach nonprofit that was footing part of the bill and clearly deciding, in real time, whether Marcus's operation was worth their name. Command Sergeant Major Rourke, the man running the course logistics for the base, stood near the registration table with a clipboard and the unmistakable posture of someone who has spent 30 years not being impressed by civilians in tactical gear. Marcus saw me arrive in plain running clothes, no logo, no fanfare, and grinned at his buddies. "Didn't think you'd actually show," he called out, loud enough for the sponsors to hear. "Let's see how tough you really are." I signed in at the table without a word, handed over my ID, and watched Rourke start matching names to his roster and waiver sheets, routine, procedural, the kind of paperwork nobody in that crowd was paying attention to except him. Marcus went first through the early obstacles, playing to the small crowd, shouting encouragement to himself, milking every wall climb for applause. When it was my turn, I didn't perform. I moved the way I'd been trained to move, economical, controlled, no wasted motion, through the cargo net, the low crawl under wire that still smelled the same after 10 years, the rope climb that used to separate the people who quit from the people who didn't. Somewhere around the 3rd obstacle, I noticed the crowd had gotten quieter than a charity fun run usually gets, and somewhere around the 5th, I noticed Rourke wasn't watching Marcus anymore. I finished the course in a time that would have been unremarkable to me a decade ago and was, apparently, not unremarkable to anyone watching now. I was still catching my breath, hands on my knees, mud on my forearms, when I heard Rourke's voice cut across the field, not loud exactly, but the kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it's used to being obeyed. "Everyone, stand down." I looked up. He was holding my waiver sheet, the one where I'd filled in my full legal name and, per the instructions, relevant prior service history, because I don't have to fill out documents, not even for a family grudge match. He was staring at it, and then at me, and something in his face had rearranged itself entirely. "Captain Reyes," he said, and the way he said it, several of the sponsors actually turned around to see who he was talking to. What followed took maybe 90 seconds, though it felt considerably longer standing in the middle of it. Rourke explained, to a crowd that had gone very still, that he recognized the name because he'd trained under an officer with that exact record at this exact facility 11 years earlier, a company commander who still held the fastest recorded female time on this specific course, whose after-action reports he'd studied as a young sergeant, whose name was, quite literally, still referenced in the base's training materials. He wasn't asking if it was me. He already knew. My mother's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. Marcus, still catching his breath by the finish line, went very, very still, the particular stillness of a man doing fast math on 30 years of assumptions. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The paper had already said it for me, in language nobody could argue with, because I'd never needed to raise my voice to be believed, I just needed, finally, for someone to read the file. Rourke asked, in front of everyone, whether I'd be willing to say a few words to the group about the course, about service, about what grit actually meant, since the day was ostensibly built around that word. I said a little, not much, because I've never needed the audience the way Marcus does, just enough that the veterans nonprofit representative, a sharp older man named Franklin Osei, who I'd later learn was Patricia's uncle in one of those small world coincidences life occasionally allows itself, walked over afterward and asked, quietly, whether I'd be interested in sitting on the nonprofit's advisory board instead of the brand ambassador role they'd been informally discussing with Marcus's. Jim. Marcus stood a few feet away through that entire conversation, holding a bottle of water he never opened, hearing every word. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph, not really. It was something quieter and stranger. The specific relief of watching a fact I'd carried alone for a decade finally exist out loud, in front of the people who'd spent that decade deciding I didn't have any facts worth carrying. Marcus didn't yell. He didn't storm off dramatically the way he might have when we were teenagers. He just stood there, smaller than I'd ever seen him, while a command sergeant major addressed me by a rank my own mother hadn't known I held. Somewhere behind me, I heard Danny's voice, she'd driven up separately, hadn't told me she was coming, say, quiet and fierce, "There she is." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly who was standing behind me, and for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly who was standing in front of everyone else too. The months since Veterans Grit Day have rearranged themselves in ways I didn't fully anticipate, though looking back, maybe I should have. The Veterans nonprofit made the advisory board offer official a week later, which meant Marcus's gym quietly lost the sponsorship conversation it had been counting on to fund its expansion, not out of spite on my part, I never once brought it up, but because Franklin Osei simply preferred working with someone whose record he could verify instead of someone whose stories he couldn't. My mother has asked me, more than once now, careful and a little sheepish, why I never told her about the Army, about the Purple Heart she found out about from a stranger with a clipboard instead of from her own daughter. I've told her the truth, that I stopped explaining myself to people who'd already made up their minds, and that I didn't realize until I saw her face on that field how much I'd wanted, quietly, for someone to ask. Danny and I still talk every week, though these days it's less about what I'm surviving and more about what I'm building. She's the first person I call now when a trial goes well, and she still asks how it felt, because some habits, the good ones, are worth keeping. Marcus texted me about a month after the event, a short message, careful in a way nothing he's ever said to me has been careful, something about how he didn't know and how he should have asked. I read it twice, appreciated the effort it must have cost him, and answered with something polite and brief, because forgiveness, if it comes on my schedule now, not as a performance for an audience. And not as an apology owed to a version of me that stopped needing his approval 3 weeks before a folding table under a tent changed everything he thought he knew. I've spent my whole life being underestimated by people who never bothered to read the file. These days, I don't wait for them to ask. I just let the record speak, and I walk away before they finish reading it. If this one hit home, if you've ever been the quiet one who turned out to be carrying more than anybody bothered to notice, tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for the next story.